Okay, now it's recording. At least I didn't get too far. Okay, so children's earliest negations, they occur in just these simple one word sort of utterances. So things like no or all gone. And so these are expressions of, the lack of existence of something or the rejection or denial of something. So saying like, no, no, mommy, maybe if the child's upset and they don't want their mom to come in and comfort them. And so it starts with these single word negations, and then there starts to be some more progress in that as the child gets to the ages of about 1 or 2. Then they start to put negatives at the beginning of their shorter, usually 2 to 3 word sentences. So, as an example, no sit down, no go movies, no mommy do it. And then after this stage, then children start they still will add negatives to their sentences, but they start to figure out that it usually should be placed between the subject of the sentence and also the verb. So they go from using the negative in the very beginning of the sentence to then moving it so that it starts to follow a little bit more grammatically correct rules. So saying something like I know like versus no like. And in addition to this, around this time, children start to use contractions. So saying don't instead of do not, for example. And they also start to use what are called auxiliary verbs. And auxiliary verbs are, without getting super technical, because this is not a grammar class, thankfully, but auxiliary verbs are also referred to as helping verbs. And so the main ones that are considered helping verbs are things like to be, to have, and to do. And so again, it's around the age of 2 to about 3.5. So really like, toddler stages in which they start to learn how to use contractions, but they also start to use these sort of helping verbs. So for example, I know want book, I know have, things like that. And then children start to become more and more proficient with these helping verbs. And so an example is you can't have this. I don't have money. I'm not sad now. And so, I mean, as you can see that this process is a slow process, right? It's starting at about the age of 1 when children are beginning to learn how to speak, and children are growing in sophistication. But it does take 4 to 5 years for children to start to put together what we would sort of call complete sentences, and to do so following grammatical rules properly. So during this time, there's an interesting development. A researcher, Belugi, has come to call it the thick layer of negation. Essentially, this is the use of several negation words or negatives in one sentence. So this is another part of the process of learning negations, is that children will often use multiple negatives in one sentence. So for example, I'm not afraid of nothing. No one's not going to do what I'm doing. And so these, of course, to our adult ears, right? It's like, okay, that's an error. If you have 2 negatives, they cancel each other out, whatever. But for children around this age, and this is typically around 3.5 to 4, that they're using typically double negations. These seem to be indicative of what kids at this age understand to be the correct way of expressing themselves with these negatives. And so this tendency to produce multiple negatives, it lasts for quite a long time, largely into elementary school. And so it appears that kids use these to really emphasize the negative characteristic of what they're talking about. So in the child's mind, okay, just having one negative word in there is not enough. I really got to double down and have two to emphasize the fact that I'm not afraid of nothing. And so what is interesting, just as a side note, is that the majority of the world's languages are actually okay. You can still speak and understand what the person's saying with these double negatives. Even though in English it doesn't, right? The idea of, well, these two negatives cancel out. But that isn't the case in a lot of the other languages in the world. And so that's the process of how children learn how to say no and how to use negatives. Now we're going to move on to how kids learn how to ask questions. And so this process is also kind of similar to learning how to use negative. There's the word, negative sentences. Um, so um, children learn how to ask yes/no questions and questions that start with like WH words, so like what, where, why, when. Kids learn how to ask this pretty early. And if you have ever interacted with toddlers, you're very aware of this because their favorite word is usually why. And they will say it over and over and over again. Why? So kids are pretty good at picking up these kinds of sentence or question asking abilities. And so, generally, as they are learning this ability, the WH words will go at the very beginning of the sentence. Where daddy go? What that? And then they start to include those helping verbs, those auxiliary verbs, but not in the way that adults do. So at this stage, they're starting to add more in terms of vocabulary words and are starting to understand the relationship between different kinds of words and sentences. But they're still trying to work out the rules here. So for example, they're often going to get the order wrong. So they'll say things like, where you are going, why she is playing, why not me can't dance. And then finally, as the child continues to age, they start to sequence the words in their sentences according to the way that we as adults use them. So they're putting all of the words in the correct order, and they're able to say things like, "Well, why did they talk like that? How can he be a doctor?" And as you can imagine, the WH questions are slower to develop than yes/no questions. And this makes sense because asking yes or no based kinds of questions are really straightforward. Whereas asking questions with these WH words, it often involves this inversion, this switching around of the auxiliary verbs, like we see in where you are going. And so there's an extra step there in the child's understanding and correctly using the grammatical rules that dictate the order of words and sentences. Versus asking yes or no based questions. Those are a lot simpler for children to do. And again, this is another process that takes several years to acquire. So now we're going to switch from talking about speech production to talking about understanding language. And so evidence shows us that infants are able to they show sort of the early signs of comprehension around 6 months of age. Um, And there have been some studies with infants and their ability to recognize their own names. And so in this study by Mendel et al., there were infants who were around 4 to 5 months of age. And they found that these babies were more likely to turn their heads towards the sound of their names. But it was really rare that they would turn their head in the direction of a name that they heard that was maybe similar in the emphasis or the tone of it and the length. So, for example, Megan instead of Rachel. So these babies were able to realize, oh, okay. So even though there might be these sort of phonologically based similarities between these words, or the intonation, the rhythm of the way that it's spoken, they're starting to understand, oh, there's a certain set of sounds that corresponds to me. And so in addition, 6 month olds, they also start to understand a handful of words around this stage of development as well. And so there is this study by Tinkoff and Jezik in 99 that showed a baby, two videos that were side by side. And so in one of the videos, the baby saw its mom, and in the other video, saw its dad. And then the baby heard the words mommy or daddy. And so what these researchers found was that the babies looked longer at the video of their mom when the word mommy was presented when that video was there. And same thing happened when the video of the dad and the daddy label were presented at the same time. So this idea that these congruent conditions, right, this match between the visual of mom and the verbal mommy, meant that these babies, they were looking longer at it. And the idea is if they're looking longer at it because it makes sense. It's something that they understand. And also I lost my train of thought. Oh, and they also found that in the same study, they showed, or not showed, they played other words just to see, like, are there any differences between the words that babies will pay attention to? And they showed a preference. They paid more attention to what are called content words. So essentially nouns, like cookie, mommy, play, shoe, versus like function words in a sentence. So things like the, is, but. Babies didn't really care about that. And so again, this is evidence that suggests to us that these babies around 6 months, this is when their ability to understand language is starting to come online. And then at about 7 months, babies have shown understanding of the relationship that it can exist between the emotional tone of someone's voice and their facial expressions. So there was a study done by Walker Andrews in 1986. And so in this study, he showed babies videos of either happy faces or angry faces. And then he also paired them with recordings of either happy sounding voices or really angry sounding voices. Which to me, I'm like, if I had to do that research and I had to play an angry voice at a baby, I would feel really bad. But so what he did was he mixed these the sound conditions of the different tones of voice with the video conditions. And in the videos, only part of the face was visible to the baby. So the mouth was covered so that the baby could only focus on the eyes and the forehead. And so what he found was that the babies, they tended to look longer at the conditions where there was this match between the emotion on the face and the emotion in the voice. So they looked longer at the happy video when it was the happy voice that was paired with it, and vice versa. And so again, suggests to us that there's this understanding of this connection of like, oh, okay, the happy voice goes with the happy face. That makes sense, and I'm going to pay attention to it. And so a couple months down the line after that, babies are able to understand differences in word labels that are applied to similar looking objects. So for example, they're able to differentiate if you tell them airplane, here's the toy airplane versus here's the toy bird. And they're also able to differentiate between animate objects, so that is living things, and inanimate objects. So at this stage, babies are able to recognize that there's a difference in the family golden retriever and the stuffed animal dog that it has. That even though they look very similar, there's something different about them, the way that they move and the way that that baby then goes about interacting with them. And then about a month after that, around 10 months or so, babies start to show that they are able to understand single words. And words that generally in the past had involved some sort of physical cueing, pointing out to the baby, that's a doggy. At this stage, you can ask a 10-month-old baby generally, where's the dog? And the baby will look at the dog. You don't need to point to the dog. You don't need to, kind of direct the baby's attention anywhere. The baby is able to identify that labels, words are associated with certain objects. And then between the ages of like 18 to 24 months, similar also to when that language production really takes off, so too does a child's comprehension abilities around this time. And so a study by Benedict in 1979, it looked at the vocabulary of young children. Now, this wasn't a huge study. It had a smaller sample size, but generally, of the children who were on the younger end of things in the study, so around 14 months, they were able to understand about 50 words. But those who were only 2 months older, they were able to understand 100 to some of them even up to 200 words. And so again, we have this explosion of comprehension abilities that seems to be developing at the same time as this really big increase in a child's vocabulary and speech production abilities. And so there's another study related to this by Hirsch, Pasek, and Golenkoff. And so in this study, they showed videos to 19-month-olds, so about a year and a half old kids, and they showed them videos that were depicting certain actions. So for example, Big Bird is tickling Cookie Monster. Cookie Monster is playing with Oscar, whatever other Sesame Street characters. I think they use them in this study, and I don't know how that works with copyright, but that's great. Good for you guys. Anyway, so essentially these videos showed a sequencing of certain events, that one individual was doing something to another individual. And so they found that these year and a half olds, they looked longer at the condition where the action that was being depicted matched up with what the researcher was reading to them about it. So again, if the video was showing Big Bird tickling Cookie Monster, and that description is what the researcher read off to the child was paying more attention to that. They were looking at that longer in comparison to instances in which the description and what was happening in the video weren't matching up. And so this suggests to us that there's an early understanding that comes online at this point of word order as well, and understanding what the differences in word order can be suggesting to us or conveying to us. So, and this is related to language comprehension, but also ties back into pragmatics. So pragmatics, you might remember, these are our understanding of the social rules that are involved when we use language. And so this is where a child's ability to communicate becomes even more sophisticated. So it's not just learning, what words to say, but how to go about saying them to people and how to go about understanding what other people are saying to you. So these are things that we've talked about before briefly when we talked about pragmatics. So things like taking turns in a conversation, what kind of information you should say during a conversation. It should be relevant. It should be on topic. You don't want to confuse people by providing too much new information where they're like, what are you talking about? You have to provide context and things like that. And so children are able to pick up on these pragmatic rules, these social rules sort of governing language pretty quickly. By the time that they're about 7 months old, they are able to understand and they can kind of conform or go along with the rule of turn taking. So babies around this age, they understand that there's this give and take in conversations. And then this turn taking becomes more sophisticated as the child gets older. So one of the things that this turn taking requires is that the speaker is anticipating when the person that they're talking to is going to be finished with what they're saying. And so young children, they take longer to take their turn than adults do. Again, if you've ever had a conversation with a child, you might notice, oh, they're maybe a little slower to pick up, oh, okay, it is my turn to go, or oh, you're done talking, okay. But again, as they practice this, they get more and more sophisticated with it. And then another part of turn taking that they learn is understanding when the person they're talking to is not done talking. And also they learn how to convey when they are not done talking as well. So kids learn to use phrases like, and then, to indicate that, well, I was taking a break to, either collect my thoughts or catch my breath or whatever, but I'm still talking. Just because I've made this vocal pause, it doesn't mean that that's it, I'm done, it's your turn. And then as kids continue getting older, so around like toddler age, they begin to work on learning the rule that says that you should be relevant in a conversation. And so again, there is this developmental progression that takes place during this time, meaning that 2-year-olds are more likely to either go with an irrelevant or a relevant remark. They're still trying to figure it out. So for example, saying, how are you? My doggy went poop on the floor. That's more likely of a child who is closer to 2 years of age, right? They're not understanding that conversations should, generally always be relevant. They're like, hi, I'm starting a conversation. Also, let me tell you about this thing my dog did. But as they get closer to 3, they start to become more relevant. They become better at sort of staying on topic with conversations. And then by the time that they're about 4 or 5, most kids are able to respond relevantly the majority of the time. And so also around the age of ending toddlerhood, beginning, oh no, that's not what I wanted to do. Beginning like, early childhood. Kids are also learning about perspective taking skills in conversation. And if you think back to when we talked about theory of mind, or if you've ever taken a child development class, you might remember that this is also around the time where children are able to not only have an understanding that they as a self, as an individual, are separate, are different from other people, but they're also starting to learn, oh, how can I kind of understand that different perspective that you have? So not only this recognition of like, oh yeah, you're seeing things differently than I do, but this blossoming sort of ability to step into another person's shoes and try to see things, from their eyes. And so there have been a number of ways in which this perspective taking ability development has been looked at in the research. And so one of these ways is to look at the actual differences that exist in the child's perspective and then the person that they're engaging with, that person's perspective, and to see if the child modifies their speech at all on the basis of that difference. So, for example, if the child knows that a board game is not able to be seen by the partner that they're playing with, for example, or if the this is another interesting one, if they're told that the person that they're playing with is blind, then the way that the child goes about engaging in conversation with that person is generally altered. So if the child has this understanding of, okay, you can see the same chessboard I can, for example, then they're going to talk to you in a different way than if they think that they're playing with somebody who, maybe grandpa's vision isn't so good these days. And so they're likely to be interacting with grandpa in different ways. I mean, using different kinds of language, probably being more descriptive too. No, grandpa, I don't think you should move your pawn there, grandpa, because if you move it there, then next time I can do this. I don't know if you want to have it in that area, for example. And that would be interesting to have like a young child who was able to say all of that and also play chess with grandpa. But you know what, kids kids are full of surprises. So um anyway, so again, one way to sort of see how these perspective taking skills might be developing is to see if they go about adjusting their speech. Another way to look at perspective taking skills is to see whether children adjust their speech for their conversation partners who are younger than them. And so a study by Schatz and Gelman actually gave us some evidence that they do. Children generally will adjust their speech. So they were looking at younger children in this 1973 study, and they found that the 4-year-olds who were in their study, they modified their speech pretty notably when they were talking to a 2-year-old, in comparison to when they were talking to another 4-year-old, and also in comparison to when they were talking to an adult. So it seems like children understand that they might need to change the way that they are talking about things because their perspective and their experiences of the world are different. As a 4-year-old, you're able to realize, oh, you're 2. You're maybe I need to talk kind of more like a baby. Maybe you won't understand all this. I'm a big girl. I'm in preschool, but you don't know as much. So I have to talk to you differently. And in addition to this as well, children who are a little bit older. So once these perspective taking skills have really started to take place when they're in about preschool, um, they start to give their conversational partner information about, so they're giving them context, and they are able to try to convey to their conversational partner what is new information, and then what is also something that's already known by, or they think that is already known by the other person that they're having the conversation with. So usually young kids do this by stressing it. So a young child might say, my doggy, or my doggy, depending on what might be new information, um, or what's been going on in the context of the conversation. And then as children advance past their preschool years, they begin using more specific words to signal to their conversation partner that information might be new or it might be contextually relevant. So they tend to use again, this is not to get all technical grammatical, but the indefinite article. So the word a is an indefinite article. And they also, and the use of a is often used to signal, hey, this is new information. Whereas using the word the tends to be used with information that these kids are like, yeah, you already know about this. And this ability to use certain vocal indicators when communicating, this develops throughout elementary school. So throughout, kids are usually about 9 or 10 when they've really sort of started to master this. So on a different level in terms of pragmatics and understanding the social rules governing language and how to understand it, kids, they learn what should be said and what shouldn't be said in certain circumstances. But of course, until kids have really gotten the hang of the nuance of this, they can say some pretty inappropriate things for the context. So for instance, there's this story about a young boy who saw his dad beginning to fall asleep in church. And so he stood up and yelled, "Be quiet, everyone. My daddy is trying to sleep." There's also one that my family likes to bring up almost every Christmas. It was the time that as a 4-year-old, I kind of ruined my aunt's Christmas party for all the other kids who were there, and maybe ruined their belief in Santa too. Because when Santa came out, I yelled at the top of my lungs so that everyone could hear, "That's not Santa, that's my Uncle Terry." So again, as a 4-year-old, right, I didn't understand the pragmatics of, oh, just because I might have an understanding of what's going on doesn't mean that other people won't. Um, Also, I don't know what my belief in Santa was like at that time. So I don't know if I was like a jaded 4-year-old and I was like, whatever, Santa doesn't exist. All the rest of you need to know the truth. Or if I was just genuinely shocked that my Uncle Terry was wearing a white beard. I don't know. Anyway, all that to say, the saying "kids say the darndest things" is true. And it's often because they haven't mastered fully all of the pragmatics, all of the different complexities of communicating and understanding how to communicate with others. And so children, they also learn that there's a certain role that they take in a conversation when they are the listener, when they're on the receiving end of information. And so this is usually done by things like smiling, nodding their head, keeping their eyes focused on the speaker, not like looking around the room, sometimes by verbalizing things like saying like, uh-huh, or like, mm. And so in one study on this, the researchers, they looked at how 3-year-olds and how 5-year-olds interacted with adults. And so they were talking with these adults about things like toys, movies, their siblings, things like that. And so they found that there's a big difference between these 3-year-olds and the 5-year-olds. So, for example, like saying like "uh-huh" in a conversation with an adult, the majority of the 3-year-olds were not doing this. But about half of the 5-year-olds were. They had picked up that you, as a listener, you sometimes go "uh-huh" or "oh" in response to your conversational partner. And also there's a big difference between the body language piece of communication, so nodding their heads. So, 2/3 of the 3-year-olds knew, "Oh, okay, I shake my head yes when I am a listener in a conversation," whereas all of the 5-year-olds in the study, they did that. And so also interestingly enough during this time, and again, it makes sense, right? As their theory of mind is becoming more sophisticated and developed. And we know that theory of mind is important for the ability to be empathetic. Um, is that kids around this time, they also start to learn ways in which to make others feel better. So maybe going and patting somebody on the hand, telling them it's okay. Also, being able to, in the moment, they might be really mad, but realizing, okay, maybe it's not okay for me to call him a butt face, even though I want to. Um, and so again, we see this growing of both perspective taking and also empathy building as well during this time. So we've been talking a good deal about the details of language development throughout childhood. And so our use of language in a wide variety of areas in our lives, and the fact that language is uh, often pretty involved in different cognitive abilities that we develop too, it raises a really important question about how, if it does, how language might influence our other cognitive abilities. And so there are a couple of different views on this. So um, on the more extreme end of the spectrum of this sort of debate is that, well, language and cognition are totally separate. Your linguistic abilities are very different separately from your other cognitive abilities, like your problem solving, for example. And then the sort of extreme opposite stance of that is that, well, actually language and cognition are really intertwined, and they have this sort of reciprocal influence on one another. And then, of course, because the world is not actually black and white, there's a middle ground. There's a camp of people who support a middle ground between this more extreme idea of that, well, language and cognition, they might be related and connected in some ways, and they also might be sort of more separate processes in other ways. So there were two really well-known linguists in the 20th century, Benjamin Lee Whorf and Edward Sapir. Um, their last names got put together for this concept that we're going to talk about. But interestingly enough, they never actually published work together. So even though this is what we're going to talk about is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, they never actually collaborated. What ended up happening was there's such a large overlap in their ideas that essentially people just ended up giving both of them credit. And so we're going to talk about this hypothesis. So sort of generally, it takes the stance um, of the fact that language and cognition are involved with one another. So it's definitely not in agreement with the idea that, well, language is totally off in its own place, doing its own thing in comparison to other cognitive processes. But within this hypothesis, there are kind of two different forms that it takes regarding what this relationship between language and cognition kind of looks like and how that plays out. So there is the what's called the strong version. It's also referred to as linguistic determinism. But most people just refer to as the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And so this is called the strong hypothesis or the stronger view because it states that a person isn't able to understand a concept if they don't have a word for that concept in their language. So there's this idea that the language that we speak and the ways in which the language that we speak functions, it determines how we think and understand things. So if there is not a certain word or certain, like I said, concept or idea or phrase in English, then you're not going to be able to understand that if you're talking to somebody in a different language who might have a particular concept that you're not at all familiar with that doesn't exist in the English language.
Um, Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, with that concept of language being needed to understand something else,
Mm-hmm.
how would that explain like where we came up with the words for concepts we have like today? So, if we didn't have the words originally to describe something, then how did we understand it, if that makes sense? And then how can we moving forward be like, oh, now I'm learning that this means this, I'm going to call it this? Or are we just kind of like capped in the English language forever?
We're just stuck forever. No, we're definitely not. And Chase, you're bringing up a great point. And as we continue talking about these, the comparing and contrasting the sort of two versions of this hypothesis, we'll see that there are actually some problems. And again, if we have this more black and white understanding of, well, it's either this or this, most of the time that doesn't account for everything that actually takes place. So we're going to talk about that, but that's a great point, because that's often a criticism that's been brought up against this strong version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And so that takes me to my next point is there is no empirical evidence that supports the strong version in and of itself. There is evidence that we're able to think about things even if we don't have a particular term for it. And so in contrast to this, we have what has also been come to call the weak version, or the linguistic influence or linguistic relativity. And so this idea is different in that it it proposes that the way that we think and understand things is influenced by language. So the idea that it's not fully dictated by our language, but the way that we think about things and believe things and interact with language is very influential. So go ahead and skip past that. So all this to say is that because we don't have very strong empirical evidence for the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in its really strong, very deterministic form, it is become largely unsupported. Like Chase pointed out, that's not actually the way in which our minds work. So today, most cognitive psychologists they would take more of that sort of middle road approach, a little bit more on the side of the weak version of Sapir-Whorf. Um, and so most psychologists would suggest, or cognitive psychologists, I should say, would suggest that there are some aspects of our perception that are going to be affected by the language that we speak. Um, but that language doesn't entirely restrict or dictate our understanding of the world. So, as an example, if you've ever heard this word Schadenfreude, I think I'm saying it correctly. I don't speak German, so apologies if you do and if I've said it wrong. This is a German word that means just feeling really happy because someone else is miserable. Um, and so there's no, like, we don't have a similar term in English, right? We don't have like, oh, Schadenfreude, that's like da 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 in English. So we don't have a similar term. There's not like this one-to-one translation that you can do. But it wouldn't be true to say that, oh, well, as an English speaker, I've never experienced that feeling, or I can't understand that because I don't have that word. Even though we don't have an English equivalent to this specific word, I still understand the concept. I can still think back to the times where I'm like, ooh, yeah, that was, I was really happy that somebody lost, or that somebody that I'm annoyed by embarrassed themselves or something like that. I can still understand the underlying concept, even though I don't have the same label to add to it. So just because, like I said, there isn't this same sort of concept in the English language doesn't mean that my thinking about it is restricted. And however, on the other hand, even though language isn't completely deterministic, it still can have quite an influence on us in the way that we think about things. So there have been studies done with speakers of languages who use like feminine and masculine nouns. So, for example, like in Spanish for chair, la silla, the la is indicative of this feminine noun. And they found that, for example, people who speak Spanish or German, these languages where they do have these gendered nouns, they came to attribute certain more feminine or masculine characteristics. So if things were masculine, if it was a masculine noun, most people, at least in that study, they saw that noun, that object, as having more masculine, more manly characteristics. And same with the more feminine nouns. And so, again, we do see that there is this influence that can happen to our perception. So overall, it seems like there's quite a bit of nuance when it comes to understanding how our language might be shaping our thoughts and our beliefs. And even though there isn't very much evidence at all for the strong version of this hypothesis, it still continues to come up in circles, outside of cognitive psych. So, for example, it's a major plot point in the movie Arrival. This is a sci-fi movie, I think from 3 years. What year is it now? I don't even know. 3 years ago now. Whenever 2018, I think was. But anyway, it's this strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is actually a pretty major plot point in this movie. It's a sci-fi movie that looks at the ways in which in a visiting alien language is affecting human thinking abilities here on Earth. So it seems like, even though in the literature it seems like this debate about language and cognition, how they relate to each other, is sort of answered, we're still obviously very curious about it, just in general as people. All right. Well, any questions before we end for today? All right. Well, happy Friday, everyone. Way to make it through another week. I hope that you're able to get some good rest this weekend. And again, if you have any questions about the test, please feel free to let me know. All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
everyone take care, and I will
Thank you.
see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.